thugs tied the couple to chairs in the garage, doused them with gasoline, and prepared to commit the brutal act. As the couple groaned in pain, the thugs set them on fire, burning them alive right there in the dark garage. The movie opens with a shot of an airplane touching down on the runway. The scene then cuts to a car, where the protagonist of the story, Jimmy Vickers, a special ops interrogation officer, listens to an old voicemail. The voice of a woman, presumably his mother, plays, expressing her eagerness to see him soon and wishing for his safe return home. The man appears to be in great distress while he's going back home. Upon arriving, he listens to another voicemail from his friend, Griffin, who offers condolences and tries to comfort him. It's clear that a tragic event has taken place, leaving Jimmy overwhelmed with grief. Later, he heads to a bar. Jimmy then questions the bar owners, Debs and Terry, about the incident. Terry insists he doesn't know anything, but Jimmy challenges him, pointing out that Terry lives just 50 yards from his parents' house, close enough to have heard their screams. Terry, visibly irritated, warns Jimmy to leave if he's only there to stir up trouble. Overcome with grief and rage, Jimmy grabs Terry by the collar and gets into a fight with a stranger. Debs quickly intervenes, urging Terry to share what he knows. Reluctantly, Terry admits that he called the fire service that night and reveals that he saw 4 gang members break into the house. He recalls hearing Jimmy's father scream, but paralyzed by fear, could do nothing but watch from his window. As the pieces of the story begin to come together, and later we see Jimmy in the burnt garage at the house where supposedly his parents were killed. He looks around, his eyes settling on an old photograph, triggering memories of his mother and father. The scene then shifts back to a few days earlier, bringing us to the same house when his parents were still alive. Jimmy's mother asks his father, George, to mow the lawn before Jimmy arrives, wanting everything to look neat for his return. Excited to see their son again, they eagerly anticipate his homecoming. George agrees to take care of the lawn later when he gets back. Meanwhile, elsewhere, 4 gang members sit in a car, snorting illegal substances as they wait for their next target. One of the gang members confidently assures the others that their next target makes a money run every day. Soon after, a young woman exits a building, heading to the bank to deposit cash. The gang springs into action, donning rabbit masks as they tail her car. As she reaches the end of the road, they intercept her, forcibly pulling her from the vehicle. As one of the gang members frantically searches the car for the money, but comes up empty-handed, fate takes a turn. Jimmy's father, George, happens to be driving by and immediately stops at the scene. The gang orders him to leave, but when one of them strikes him with a baseball bat, George fights back. With a powerful punch, he lands a devastating blow, smashing the attacker's head open. George then turns to face the remaining gang members, firmly ordering them to leave. One of them threatens him with a knife, but as the sound of approaching police sirens fills the air, they quickly flee. Moments later, the police arrive at the scene. In his statement, George explains that he only wanted to stop the attacker and never intended to kill him. Chief Inspector Holland, with a hint of sarcasm, remarks that George should have thought of that before striking with the baseball bat. He then proceeds to arrest George on suspicion of manslaughter. Later that day, the 3 remaining gang members report back to their boss, Warren, explaining how the robbery went awry. When Warren asks about his brother, he is stunned to learn that he has been killed. Furious over his brother's death, Warren forbids the gangsters from coming back until George is dead. After George is released on bail and returns home, Warren and his men trail him. 2 thugs approach the front door and knock, while the other 2 move around to the back of the house. One of the thugs threatens to assault the mother while George is pinned against the wall with a knife pressed to his mouth. The same gangster who threatened him sneers that he should have never played the hero that day. The gang then binds the couple to a chair in the garage and douses them in petrol. As the couple whimpers, Warren sets the room ablaze, burning them alive. The scene then shifts to the present day, where Jimmy stands in the same charred garage. His police friend Griffin tells him that a neighbor spotted a black BMW speeding by around 11 that night, but didn't get a chance to catch the license plate. Griff suspects that the gang involved in the conflict with George is responsible for his murder, but the police lack evidence to prove it. After asking Griff to send him the CCTV footage of the theft, Jimmy leaves the garage, his eyes filled with tears. The next morning, he visits his parents' grave to pay his respects. While Jimmy is in the church, his wife Morgan arrives. It is revealed that they were on the brink of divorce before the tragedy. Morgan reminds him that he missed the funeral, despite her sending him 5 emails. However, seeing his grief, she offers comfort, assuring him that he doesn't have to face this alone and that he's welcome to visit her flat anytime. The next day, Griff meets with Jimmy and reveals that the black BMW belongs to Warren, who, according to the investigation, is the brother of the man George accidentally killed that day. He then hands Jimmy the CCTV footage of the robbery. That night, as Warren leaves the gym, another vehicle suddenly collides with his car from behind. Warren steps out of his car, only to see Jimmy waiting in the vehicle behind him. Unaware of the danger, he starts hurling insults at the wrong person. However, Jimmy, a trained special ops officer, swiftly overpowers him and knocks him out. When Warren regains consciousness, he finds himself tied to the front seat, watching as Jimmy douses his car with petrol. Jimmy reminds Warren of the couple he murdered 2 weeks earlier, but instead of showing remorse, Warren erupts in anger, insisting he did the right thing. With a twisted sense of pride, he even recounts how he assaulted Jimmy's mother that night. Struggling to contain his rage, Jimmy keeps his composure and demands Warren reveal the names of his gang members, offering to let him go in exchange. After Warren writes down the names, Jimmy lights a cigarette and walks away. Later, he makes his way to Morgan's place, but struggles to speak for long due to a stab wound. As he tries to stand, Morgan notices something is wrong. Seeing the blood on his shirt, she quickly brings him inside and stitches his wound. Though they were on the brink of divorce, the incident draws them closer, leading Jimmy to spend the night at Morgan's place. The next day, Warren's death makes headlines, but given his history of drug dealing and crime, few are surprised. Upon hearing the news, one of the gang members, Rob, suspects foul play. He and Leon rush to Warren's business partner, Caleb, believing he might have killed Warren over their dispute about profit shares. Rob and Leon bang on Caleb's door and confront him, but he has no idea what they're talking about. His girlfriend intervenes just in time, allowing Caleb to deny the accusations and warn them never to set foot on his block again. That night, Griff visits Jimmy, urging him not to take justice into his own hands. However, unlike Griff, Jimmy believes the corrupt system will never put an end to these criminals, who continue to ruin families across the town. The police merely take statements and go through the motions while the criminals mock them, even spitting in their faces. Later, Griff arrives at a crime scene where a man has been killed during an armed robbery. It is there that he finally sees the deep flaws within the police department, especially when Chief Inspector Holland dismisses the incident, coldly stating that the shopkeeper should never have fought back. When Griff, visibly emotional, argues that the man was only defending his livelihood, Holland dismissively tells him to relax. In Holland's view, the victim's wife will receive an insurance payout, and that should be enough to satisfy everyone. Meanwhile, Jimmy continues his hunt, setting his sights on the next gang member, Ryan. Jimmy drags Ryan to an abandoned location, restrains him to a chair, and clamps his mouth shut. With the skills of a seasoned special ops investigator, vengeance consumes him. He forces cement down Ryan's throat, making him choke and suffocate. By the next day, the police discover Ryan's body, solidified from the chest up due to the hardened cement. DCI Holland takes a keen interest in the case, seeing it as a potential stepping stone for his promotion. Meanwhile, Terry, the bar owner, hands Holland CCTV footage from his bar, showing Jimmy loading an unconscious man into the back of his car. Despite Debs urging him to stay quiet, Terry refuses to take the risk. He doesn't want his pub to end up in flames like George's house. The police interrogate Morgan about Jimmy, but she deceives them while he remains hidden in her apartment. Later, at the mart, Jimmy notices 2 officers tailing him. As they close in to arrest him, a car screeches to a halt. 2 imposing men step out, attacking the officers and creating a diversion that lets Jimmy escape with them. Jimmy is taken aback when he sees Colonel Leach stepping out of the car. As a crucial asset to Special Ops, Jimmy's retrieval is important enough for the Colonel to handle personally, granting him just 48 more hours to settle his affairs, specifically dealing with the remaining gang members. The Colonel makes it clear that after that, Jimmy must return to duty. Meanwhile, Griff approaches his colleague Joe, the SWAT leader, and suggests that this case shouldn't be taken too seriously. Sensing something off, Joe presses him, asking if he knows the killer. Griff then admits the truth. He's a friend of Jimmy, whose parents were brutally murdered. When Joe insists that Jimmy is out of control, Griff counters, arguing that Holland is no better. He accuses Holland of using this case as a stepping stone to becoming superintendent, warning that his corruption and negligence could spell disaster for the department. Jimmy continues his quest for revenge, confident that with the army backing him, he won't be caught. Meanwhile, at a strip club, Leon receives an envelope containing a photo of the dead Ryan. Realizing he's in danger, he flees the club, running frantically only to be ambushed and knocked out by Jimmy. When Leon regains consciousness, he finds himself restrained, his lower body chained to a gate and his upper body secured to a car. Leon is clueless about why he's being tortured, which only fuels Jimmy's rage. Showing no mercy, Jimmy gets into the car and floors the accelerator, ripping Leon's body in half. The next day, Colonel Leach encounters DCI Holland at a restaurant. He demands that Holland turn over all the police files on Jimmy, making it clear that Jimmy is the Army's concern, not his. Upon hearing this, Holland refuses, asserting that if the colonel takes the law into his own hands, he deserves to be in jail. In response, Colonel Leach defends Jimmy's actions by recalling an event from 2009. He explains that the Army had captured the terrorist behind a planned major attack on the British mainland, but the suspect refused to reveal any information. However, it took Jimmy just 10 minutes alone with the terrorist to break him and extract the truth. Colonel Leach remarks that men like Jimmy don't fear death, they embrace it. Finally, he warns that Jimmy will eliminate his targets and disappear without a trace. Undeterred, DCI Holland accepts the challenge, vowing to track Jimmy down. Before leaving, Colonel Leach warns Holland that if he so much as touches Jimmy, there will be severe consequences. In the next scene, the police superintendent and commissioner urgently meet with the Army chief. Wasting no time, the Army chief makes it clear under no circumstances should Jimmy be taken into custody. Without disclosing too much, the officials inform the superintendents that Jimmy is vital to Britain's top-secret agencies. The Army hierarchy instructs the police higher-ups to report directly on the progress of the investigation. Later that night, the last surviving gang member, Rob, one of those responsible for Jimmy's parents' murder, is escorted outside by a drug dealer. Jimmy forces Rob to knock on the door and uses him as a shield, though Rob later manages to escape. He then eliminates all the remaining drug dealers linked to the gang, sparing only Caleb, Warren's business partner. Restraining Caleb to a chair, Jimmy begins mixing a concoction of chemicals, the very same substances the dealers use to manufacture their drugs. Jimmy first dissolves all the cash in the bucket before pouring the corrosive mixture over Caleb's head, melting him alive. Meanwhile, DCI Holland uncovers that Constable Griffin has been feeding Jimmy intel from the start. Confronting him, Holland demands to know Jimmy's next target, but Griffin refuses to betray him and instead urges Holland to stay out of Jimmy's way. However, Holland remains determined to track down Jimmy, defying his superintendent's orders. He locates the last gang member who escaped the previous night at the hospital. Meanwhile, the injured man is later seen limping through Jimmy's apartment, rifling through some letters. Before long, Jimmy catches up to him, forcing him to drive toward the seaport. Jimmy forces Rob to kneel with his hands tied and pulls out a syringe, warning that it contains a lethal aerosol that will burn a person from the inside out. Unfazed, Rob spits at Jimmy and tells him to check the trunk of his car. To Jimmy's shock, he discovers that Rob has already killed Morgan before he could take his revenge. Overcome with disbelief and exhaustion, Jimmy unloads his entire magazine into Rob just as a SWAT team, led by Holland, arrives at the scene. Griff also arrives and angrily confronts Holland for releasing Rob from the hospital, ultimately allowing him to kill Jimmy's wife. Holland defends himself, claiming he only let Rob go to track him to Jimmy, never expecting him to murder Morgan. Realizing the truth about Holland, SWAT Captain Joe orders his team to stand down, leaving Holland speechless. With no one left to stop him, a shattered Jimmy walks away, while Holland makes a last-ditch effort to intervene. Before departing, Jimmy lands a brutal punch to Holland's face, finally stopping him in his tracks. The movie closes with a scene in an alley where a random girl is seen putting out the trash. Two strangers corner the girl, grabbing her as she screams for help. At the other end of the alley, Jimmy emerges from the shadows. The thugs confront Jimmy and ask him to leave, and the screen goes dark with an evil smile of Jimmy.